am a black man trapped in a white woman's body.
If there is no standard of truth, an objective standard of truth, then who defines what truth is?
What are your thoughts on this difference between sex and gender?
When I was growing up, Alan, your sex was your gender.
How is the enemy using this agenda to infiltrate and to influence our young people?
I think it's just, it's doing a lot more damage than anything. If you hurt their feelings, and you offend them, then that's considered like a hate speech. The master plan of all of this is if he can muddle truth, it muddles the gospel.
We're not gonna go into how gruesome the bottom surgery process is.
The transgender activists are comparing this to the civil rights movement.
I don't know what YouTube's gonna do, right? This might be, this conversation, it's healthy conversation between two adults, could be considered hate speech.
We are the enemy. We are the fundamentalist Christians are the enemy of this.
To mistreat another person who has been created in the image of God, they are an image bearer of God, because they don't identify the way you want them to identify, is inhumane, it's sinful, and as Christians, we need to stop that.
I'm gonna say something really unpopular, and a lot of parents aren't gonna like it, and it's not meant to guilt anyone.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Alan here. I am so very excited to be hanging out with my friend, Melissa Doherty. She is in the house. We've done a collaboration together before, maybe one or two. I don't remember how many, but it's always a pleasure to have you on the channel, Melissa. And today, guys, we're going to be talking about something that both of us are very, very passionate about. We're going to be talking about LGBTQ. We're going to be talking about transgender, the effect that it has on children, media, free speech, athletics, the difference between sex and gender, all of these different things, censorship when it comes to YouTube. We're going to dig into all those things. And more importantly, guys, we're going to be kind of reviewing a documentary that's been out for some time. It's called What is a Woman by a guy by the name of Matt Walsh, who is one of the lead reporters on the Daily Wire. And so we know it's been out for a while, but we don't care. We want to formulate our minds and our thoughts around this and have a discussion about it. So Melissa, welcome, and so excited to have you on the beat.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. This is a topic that I'm quite passionate about, and so I'm happy to be able to talk with someone about it.
So we're going to jump right into the conversation. Melissa, just some opening thoughts about the documentary, how it was done, the topics that it covered. Did you agree? What did you like? What didn't you like? Give us your thoughts, and I'll share with you my overall thoughts if they're different from yours.
Sure. Yeah. So this is our second time watching it through. I did watch it with my almost 13-year-old daughter because she wanted to watch it. We skipped through some parts because of that. So that's probably my first con, is that there is some language in it that I wouldn't necessarily, that made me a little uncomfortable. But overall, I have to say I enjoyed the documentary. I agreed with it. I found myself enjoying Matt Walsh's use of logic in his argument. I didn't see him get mad once. I really respect that, because that can be very difficult in those situations.
Yes.
I wish it were longer. I do wish that there were certain things that he added in there, such as, for example, a lot of your viewers might know Abigail Shrier. She wrote the very popular, I would say, but it was not popular with the transgender crowd, but she is a journalist, a secular journalist that wrote Irreversible Damage about the transgender craze. And it was an amazing book. It was very well done. And I'm surprised he didn't have somebody like her on there. So I would like to see a part 2 in that sense, but I thought it was well done. He talked to many different people. And I do want to add, Matt Walsh can be a controversial character for some people. I believe that a lot of his, the things that he does say are true. And I applaud him for his use of logic. I think that's my favorite thing about him. However, I think you and I talked about this before we got on. He does have a cynical part about himself that I do not always agree with. I think that there's better ways to handle certain situations and conversations. So for that, I will fault him, but I cannot completely fault him for how he did this documentary. What do you think?
Yeah. So, guys, for those of you who do not know or you're not familiar with the documentary, let me just give you some context for it. And I hope this is not considered an actual spoiler, but the documentary, the name of it is What is a Woman? And the irony throughout the entire thing, and I don't think I'm giving too much away, but the irony of the entire documentary is that Matt Walsh is going around the world, around the country, literally around the country, around the world, and he's asking experts in this field of gender and family and children and gender reassignment and all those things, what is a woman? Mm-hmm. And the irony throughout the whole thing is that nobody within the 90-minute documentary was able to give a clear answer to what would seem to be a simple question, which is, what is a woman? And so that was the interesting thing about it. But basically, my thoughts were pretty similar to yours. I thought it was super well done from a creative standpoint, cinematography, the camera work, the people that they selected, the conversations. I thought he held it together pretty well, considering some of the responses that he was getting from people. But I thought that it really communicated what he was trying to communicate, which is, the fact that there is an agenda that we believe is a demonic agenda that the enemy is trying to propagate into our world, into our children. And I thought that he did a great job of exposing that and showing the damage and the danger of blurring the lines between womanhood and manhood and letting people identify however they want to identify. And with that being said, that's a perfect segue into a question I wanted to ask you, Melissa, because sure. In the documentary, there's this idea that people should have the right to identify however they want to identify and as whoever they want to identify, even to the point of if they feel like they want to identify as an animal. In the documentary, he interviewed somebody that wanted to identify as a wolf. So I know you have a video on this. Talk to me about that. Why is it dangerous if I all of a sudden want to identify as a cat or a cheetah or something like that? This is not to make light. This is not to make light of people who struggle with this. Just we want to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, well, there's different genres of this. So if you notice in the documentary, spoiler alert, there is a transgender woman who's Etherian and part of the furry fandom. That's like 4 different identities. A furry is different than Etherian and a trans species, and there's 4 different types of categories. You have otherkin, which is somebody that identifies as a mythological character, like a hobbit or a fairy or a mermaid. Then you have a trans species, which is very similar to Etherian, which is somebody that feels like they are an animal. They identify as an animal. Then you have a furry. Furries can identify as these things, but not everybody. Not every furry is those things. Like a furry is more of a cosplay thing. But there seems to be always this overlap. And so the problem I have overall is something that Walsh brings up a lot, is it tethered to reality? And I'm finding that because a lot of this is grounded on postmodernism, which is a skepticism of science, of objective truth, that's how and why you get away with these things. And the problem with it, Alan, is that if there is no standard of truth, an objective standard of truth, then who defines what truth is? Those who have the power. So that means that all of a sudden there's a fluid view of truth. And that is how and why we are seeing what we're seeing in our country, because postmodernism is the bedrock of gender critical theory, if you will. And that's how and why they can dismantle everything and call it a social construct and then rebuild it with their lived experience. And that is the lens through which they see the world. So if you identify as a mermaid in our country, in our society today, under the umbrella of postmodernism, that will be accepted. And furthermore, he interviewed Carl Trueman, and Carl Trueman is somebody I highly respect. He wrote a book called Strange New World. You and I talked about it before we got on. And he absolutely brings this all home with how this happened and how we got here. But we have had this growing yearning, if you will, to redefine what's real based on how we feel. So in other words, he calls it expressive individualism, and it's like a movement of your authenticity. So however what brings you happiness is being able to express what makes you feel authentic. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. This is what makes you happy. And so if anybody speaks against that, they are now an enemy of your happiness. So that's why we see the hostility. That's why we're seeing a lot of this disconnect from reality. And it's getting worse because I would argue that they do have the power right now. And that's why we see this hostility. In other words, it's like if you hurt their feelings and you offend them, then that's considered like a hate speech. And so you're looked at as the enemy. And the problem is it's like you can choose what you believe, right? You can choose what you believe, Alan. You can sit there and say, I can be a hobbit. I can go watch Lord of the Rings and dress up as Frodo, right? But you can't force others to believe that. And you can't change what's actually true. That's the problem, is that you can believe it, but now we are being forced to accept what's not true. That is the problem I'm having with this whole thing.
And that's the issue. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because really it's like, okay, if you want to identify as a cat, as a cheetah, as a wolf, as a mermaid, and if that makes you happy, by all means, go and do you, right? I'm not going to persecute you. I'm not going to, be mean or negative, because as a Christian, that's not what we're supposed to do. But then to force me to say, okay, you know what, because you feel this way, then I have to now acknowledge you as something that is not true for reality. So that would be like you, Melissa, you are a white female, right? That would be like you saying, you know what, I know what my DNA says and I know what my appearance says and shows, but you know what, I identify more as a black male. And so therefore, that's who I am. I am a black man trapped in a white woman's body. So therefore, because I feel that way, because I identify more with this people group, then everybody in the world now has the responsibility of acknowledging me as a black man. And that's the logic that is like so warped that is really not fair when it comes to forcing this agenda on, others.
Yes, and you mentioned it's a spiritual battle too. And I think this is why it's a ploy of the enemy to dismantle what's true. Because if you can muddle truth, you can muddle the identity of Jesus, you can muddle the gospel, like the very thing that people are searching for is going to be muddled. And this is why Jesus objectively says he's the truth. He is the truth. He is the way. He is the bread of life. He is what you are looking for to complete you. And I think that is the ploy, if you will, the master plan of all of this is if he can muddle truth, it muddles the gospel. Yeah. So one of the other things that was all throughout the documentary was this perceived difference between sex and gender, right? I mean, that's the hot thing now, is this idea. And it's so interesting because in the documentary, I forget who was being interviewed, but they were like, 200 years ago, if you were to ask somebody how many genders are there, it would be a simple answer, male and female. It wasn't, it literally, it would have been so simple. But nowadays you have infinite number of genders, because what they want to say, guys, is that your sex is based on DNA and biology. And they even use a word throughout the documentary. I don't know if you caught it, but it's what you've been assigned at birth. Yeah. Right? You've been assigned, not that how God created you, but because of your genitalia, because of what body parts you have, the doctor then assigned you a sex. But just because you were assigned a certain sex does not mean that's your gender, right? Your gender is who you identify as, regardless of what your biology and your DNA has to say. So what are your thoughts on this difference between sex and gender? I think it's semantics. And again, this is another key component of applied postmodernism, is you have to redefine language. And I think it's ironic, Alan, because they're saying sex and gender and that it's a social construct, right? That a social construct, for those who may not know, I'm sure a lot do, is something that has been taken for granted as true just because society says it's true. And there are lots of things that are social constructs that are good. Money is a social construct. The way that we have, that we run our cities, politics, certain policies, there's nothing wrong with that. However, that is a subjective thing. If truth is objective, it cannot be a social construct. It's tethered to reality. It is true for all people, for all times, and all places. You can scream it at all you want, but it's still going to be true. It's not a social construct. Gender is not a social construct, okay? So a binary, male and female, from time immemorial, this has been known to just be aligned with reality. The irony is them redefining sex and gender is a social construct. They are redefining it under their own definition. And I think that the truest irony is that is the social construct. You are dismantling something that's true and redefining it for your agenda, for your identity politics. And it's to further their whatever they're trying to do in our country, but it's not true. So they're taking, like math, for example. If you can redefine math and make it into something that is not correlated to reality to fit an agenda of yours, that would be then a social construct. That is something that that is human made, that is made by society to serve a purpose. But it's not actually, it's not something that's fluid, or you make it fluid even when it's not. So I think that is the basic irony of it. I think it's semantics. Sex and gender were the same thing. When I was growing up, Alan, your sex was your gender. Like it was just another word for sex. Like exactly. You check the box, and it was just, they were interchangeably used. And now, all of a sudden, they are redefining these terms to fit this agenda. And gender is on a spectrum, and it's really strange. You go on TikTok, and there's hundreds of pronouns that you can choose from that make no sense. Oh. You can use fae, right. Because if you identify as a fairy in the other kin kind of community, then you can choose fae, fee as your pronouns. Like it doesn't even exist. It's just more to cater to this authenticity that somebody feels on the inside. And I think it's just it's doing a lot more damage than anything. But yeah, I think that is my basic thought about the sex and gender talk on the documentary. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, and I don't mean to make light of this in any way, guys, but in the documentary, one of the things that I found I kind of chuckled at was that like Matt Walsh, he brought up the fact that, okay, why is it that you want to choose your pronouns when you can't choose your prepositions, right? He talked about if I said to you, look, I identify as a handsome black man, right? Or my adjectives, right? Or I can't choose my adjectives, right? So handsome modifies or describes me, right? Mm-hmm. So regardless of whether you think I'm handsome or not, the fact that I think I am and I identify that way, that's my adjective. My adjective is handsome. So therefore, everybody in the world now must acknowledge and cater to me because that's how I identify. Whether you think I'm ugly, whether you don't think I'm attractive or not, you must call me handsome Alan, right? Mm-hmm. Because I get the right to choose my adjectives, right? And it's kind of that same concept. It's like now you're forcing me to, instead of saying he or she, now I have to say they, and it just, kind of, once again, forces an agenda on the rest of the world. One of the things that they brought out as well was the issue of gay rights and civil rights. And I know that was something that you wanted to ask me about.
Yes.
I could talk all day about that.
Maybe that could be a video on itself. But yeah, I would actually like to get your opinion on this because I've interviewed quite a few people about this topic, about critical theory, about postmodernism, just reading everything I can get my hands on. And this is a question I ask almost everyone because that is an argument we hear, Ellen, a lot, is that the transgender activists are comparing this to the civil rights movement. They say that this is and he even interviewed I think it was a congressman or a senator in the documentary about the Equality Act. And I forgot about that, if I'm honest, until I saw the documentary again. And it's where the activists are trying to amend, if I understand correctly, the Civil Rights Act to include transgender rights. And it's really interesting because they think that they're the same. And I would love for you to break that down. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I have a lot, and I'll try to keep them somewhat brief. But as a Black man, as an African-American man, I want to be sensitive to those who may be identifying with the LGBTQ plus community. I want to be sensitive to that, but I also want to be firm in that they are two very, very different things. And so much so that I took a couple of points and wrote some things down that I want to make sure I cover. The first thing is how they're different is that historically, Blacks were way more disenfranchised as compared to whites, right? Or gays, right? So you could be white and gay, and you could still drink from the same water fountains. You could still ride buses. You could still vote. You could still go to certain colleges. You could still play on certain golf courses, right? So to compare the level of disenfranchisement or marginalization of those in the LGBTQ community and those in the African American community is really offensive, very, very offensive to people who are of color, specifically because of the level of violence that we experienced as compared to the level of violence. I'm not dismissing that people who identify in the LGBTQ camp have been mistreated. And let me just be first and firm to say this, from a Christian perspective, that is anti-Christ.
Yep.
To mistreat another person who has been created in the image of God, they are an image bearer of God, because they don't identify the way you want them to identify, is inhumane, it's sinful. And as Christians, we need to stop that, right? So we need to make sure that we're not part of the problem there. We need to love them, right? But with that being said, there is no comparison between the level of violence and hatred as it relates to, being lynched and being enslaved and, creating law, not just trying to change the law like what they're trying to do. We're talking about creating laws for the purpose of marginalizing an entire race. So we're trying to create laws so that you can't buy a house, so that you can't vote, so that you can't live in certain places, so that your kids can't go to certain schools, so your kids can't do these things. You're creating laws. So to compare those two, once again, is not wise. And then, civil rights really involves people, not behavior. Civil rights was all about how can we make rights for people. It had nothing to do with behavior. It had everything to do with people, right? And with that being said, another big one, and I know that those who identify in the LGBTQ will fight me on this, but the big difference is that as Blacks, we don't have a choice to hide who we are. Perfect example. All right. If I went into a job interview and there was someone there who was a racist, I could be qualified for that job. There's no way for me to hide the fact that I'm a Black man when I go into that interview, as much as I may want to not, right? So if that person is racist, they're going to automatically marginalize me and probably not give me the job. If you are someone who identifies in the LGBTQ plus, I understand that you identify that way, but it's not the first thing that people see. And so therefore, when people see you, they don't automatically say, oh, that person is gay, so therefore let me let me, stereotype them, or let me, have a prejudice towards this particular person. You can function in society so much so, and I know I'm going on about this, but so much so that I taught in the public school system next to a guy who was married. He had a wedding ring on. For years, I thought he was married to a woman because he didn't carry himself in any way other than just, he was manly, he was a cool guy, we got along. It wasn't until my 8th year of teaching that I learned that he actually was married to another man. So that's the point, is that you can go through society and function without these things. And then, if we want to go spiritual, the Bible doesn't say anything immoral about being black. Right? The Bible. Now that's why progressives will try to, maybe change, the Bible did, but the Bible says nothing about if you are born black or if you're a person of color, that is equating to immorality.
Solid.
Right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to all these other areas of, the Bible talks about a man should not dress as a woman should dress as a man. A man should not lay with another man the way he lays with a woman. All these things, the Bible is clear about those things. And then the last thing I'll say is this: the extent of it, right? The civil rights and the lack thereof affected millions and millions of people around the country. So just the sheer numbers of the civil rights is in no comparison to what the gay rights, people are trying to fight for gay rights. I'm not saying there's no similarities, but to compare the two, to me, is very offensive to people of color.
Alan, thank you for sharing that. I think that you made a lot of really, really good points. I don't think that the two are equal to each other. And, it reminds me of quite a few things, like even me as a woman, if somebody were to identify as a woman, does that mean they all of a sudden identify with the plight of women? There's a lot of sparring right now going on with feminists and the LGBTQ movement, because if you can't define what a woman is, what does that mean that, for the movement of the women? So it makes me understand a lot of what you're saying. And it brings me to another question I wanted to ask you about, kind of off script, but if everything's a social construct in Western society, it makes me wonder about race, right? Where if under this whole veil of redefining everything in the, name of science and being skeptic about that, race can't be a social construct any more than gender can. Nobody would say that race is a social construct. It is just
right.
What you are. But there are people that would, ironically argue different. So it's a very inconsistent thing. And it makes me wonder that, there's an agenda behind it. Whereas with the civil rights movement, that was tethered to reality. That was something that was a wrong that's always been wrong. And biblically speaking, that was an excellent point about, the trans homosexuality. It's very, very clear. People can redefine it, but it's very black and white when it comes to that. Pardon the pun. But yeah, thank you for speaking more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know something that both of us are really passionate about is the effect that this is having on our children and in our society, our communities, our neighborhoods, our schools. So let's have some conversation around that, because, I have young kids, 4 and 6, almost 5 and 6. I know your kids are a little bit older. You've made the decision to homeschool them. I don't know what went into that. I guess let's just talk a little bit about kind of how is this issue affecting, or could it possibly affect, this next generation or our children? How is the enemy using this agenda to infiltrate and to influence our young people?
Well, for me, I have an almost 13-year-old and an almost 9-year-old. And I made a whole video about this. And it was about the book Irreversible Damage by Abigail Shrier, because when I read that book, it blew my mind. It helped me see so much of it. It helped me understand, because I was trying to understand all of this. I'm like, what is this? Where did this come from? And one of the ones that blew my mind that she talked about is how it's in our schools. That's a way that a lot of the activists have come in, and under the guise of anti-bullying have been able to create a space where everybody is under the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And you're weird if you're a cisgender, right? So if you don't, like, for example, my daughter talks about how her friends have crushes on girls. All of them have crushes on girls. And I'm like, do they even know what that means? It's a social contagion. It's something that if your friends are doing it, you're going to do it.
Right.
Yeah. And
it's cool. It's the end thing now.
Exactly. And I worry about that because, and this is the other thing, is that you have more of a voice right now if you're considered an oppressed person, right? This is huge. So like and she wrote about this too, that if you're and a lot of the women, especially, she writes about the girls, like how it's really affecting a lot of the girls. And they don't want to be a girl that is technically, that's cis, because not only is it uncool, but you are not heard as...
Define cisgender, by the way, for some people who don't know what that is.
What's that? A cisgender?
Define cisgender for people who don't know what that is.
Yeah, so in their terminology, so you have the LGBTQ plus umbrella, right? Where you have the gender spectrum. You identify as however you want. A cisgender are boring people like you and me. In other words, a cisgender is somebody that identifies with the same, their sex that they were assigned at birth. I was born female and I identify as a female. That is called cisgender. And which is like majority of people. And if you're a cisgender, if you're cis, it's considered not cool. And not only that, but you're looked at as having more of a say, more of a voice, more of a lived experience. In other words, there's a huge incentive for this, for if you identify under the rainbow umbrella. If you identify as something under there, you are going to be heralded as an activist. You are standing up for something. You're the victim, and so there is strong incentive for this. And for me, this is taught in schools. You have the genderbread person, which is a real thing. I made a video about this as well. I went around to places in my city, libraries, bookstores, stores in general, finding all of the books aimed at children, like elementary age and middle school were the big ones, where this ideology is all over the place. And I live in a very, I say liberal, but that's really the wrong word. Liberal actually it was not always a bad thing. There were some good things in there, but it's very leftist, I'll say that. And they just passed a bill where if your child doesn't want their parents knowing that they changed their pronouns, or maybe even taking puberty blockers, you don't have to let the parents know. Because if they're not supportive, kind of like what Matt was talking about in the interview, in the documentary, if you're not supportive and affirmative, then you're the enemy, So, and the schools are a hot spot for this because this is where the activists go. And this was eye-opening for me. And this is one reason why I decided to homeschool my kids. And how it affects them in the future, I think it hurts them more than anything because they're denying a fundamental reality about who they are. And I think that is really the core of the issue for their identity problem. They still have depression. They still struggle with suicidal thoughts. And I think it's because they're denying the most fundamental reality about who they are and who God is. And I think that overall is going to set up our next generation for a lot of lawsuits for psychiatrists and doctors, but also for a generation that's filled with depression and anxiety. And I think that's one reason why we need to talk more about it and how to ground our children. And I told you that my oldest, she's going to be 13. I don't hide this stuff from her. I have cards on the table, conversations, and we watched the documentary. I mentioned that, and we had such good conversations about this whole thing. And I asked her what she thinks, and I told her, your friends are kind of into this stuff. What do you think about it? It's preparing her to know what's out there, and if she has a worldview that is tethered to reality, she'll be able to see these things and know better. And of course, my youngest as well. She's going to be 9, so there's only so far I can go with her as far as holding her attention and what she can understand. But But yeah, you have 2 little ones too, Alan. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and I'll share my thoughts in just a moment,
Yeah.
but one of the things that I really like that Matt brought out in the documentary is the fact that when it comes to children, they are not in the mental and emotional space to make decisions, because much of what they're experiencing is not based on reality.
Yes.
Right. And I love the fact that he went back and said so for those of you who have not seen this, it's pretty staggering, because when Matt goes around and asks these experts, people who have PhDs in this field, who are advocating for this stuff, he leaves them speechless, because he's asking them questions and they're like, I don't know. Yeah. That's a good question. Let me think about that. Like one that he brought out was, he asked the one lady, he said, hey, do you believe that, do you know kids that believe in Santa Claus?
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the lady said, oh yes, of course. And she said, well, and Matt said, well, okay, is Santa Claus real? And she said, well, he's real to them. Yeah. And then Matt was like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Is Santa Claus real? And so the point he was trying to make was that someone who's 6 or 7 years old, in their mind, the reality and the truth is Santa Claus exists, and he's the one who brings me presents, and he goes down my chimney, and I wake up Christmas morning and I have presents from Santa Claus. But we as adults all know that is not the reality, even though in that child's mind, that's the truth. And the lady couldn't say anything, and she came up with some lame excuse. But the point is that he's trying to make is that for these kids who are 12 or 13 or 14, and they decide they want to change their gender, and now this government is trying to push these laws and try to make it so that the age to choose is getting lower and lower and lower, so much so that, if a child wants to change their gender or wanting to start taking hormone pills, puberty blockers, whatever, they even want to have gender reassignment surgeries. Guys, we're talking about some very, very important stuff. You're talking about a girl who's 14 or 15 or 16 years old making a decision for herself that she wants to have a double mastectomy, that she wants, and that's just the top surgery, right? We're not going to go into how gruesome the bottom surgery process is. And so, I mean, guys, this is the length that people will go to. And even when you have that surgery, it still can't, it's impossible. All right. It's impossible to change out the hardware. Okay. The mechanics, it's impossible. You can try to dress it up and do all those things. So, as far as how it relates to children, the first thing that I would say is that it's not fair that the government is trying to make it easier for kids to make lifelong decisions that many of them end up regretting a whole lot. 7 years later, some of them end up having, suicidal thoughts and having, depression and things like that. And they're not mature enough to make those decisions, right? But another way in terms of how it's affecting the children, and this is one that everybody knows about, but it's creeping into everything, guys. It's creeping into cartoons. It's creeping into Disney films. It's creeping into YouTube. It's creeping into, Peppa Pig, that my daughter used to watch Peppa Pig. We don't let her watch that anymore because these little shows, they have this agenda. And even as adults, whenever we watch these shows, I'm convinced that every single network has it in their clause. It's got to be in your contract that you must have some representation in every single sitcom, no matter what. Even commercials. You can't even watch a football game now. I can't even watch a football game with my son without seeing some sort of drug commercial with 2 guys kissing. And it's about AIDS and how it can prevent AIDS and stuff like that. So guys, I'll say this as a parent, and I'll stop because I've been talking for a while, is be careful what you allow your kids to consume and watch whenever you're not watching them, because this stuff is creeping into every phase of our society.
Yep. Alan, I'm really glad you talked about that. That was good. Thank you for mentioning all that. I'm going to say something really unpopular, and a lot of parents aren't going to like it, and it's not meant to guilt anyone. You and I are parents, and we know what that's like. But the cell phones, the smartphones, they're My almost 13-year-old, she will not have a cell phone until she has to have one. I am convinced more than ever that this thing causes more anxiety. It causes more depression. And when the iPhone, there's statistics on this, when they released the iPhone, the suicide rates, anxiety, everything for girls specifically, through the roof. Just because here's the thing, there's a disconnect that we get with these things. And here we are talking about immature minds. Like, I mean, you got to be 18 to get a tattoo because you're too young and dumb to make such a permanent decision. But if you want to get puberty blockers and go on TikTok and watch about how you can fit in with, you know, the crowd of people, we will make you fit in. We know how this feels. Here, come, join us. It's very cult-like, if you ask me. Then you can do that. Like, if you want to get top surgery, if you want to get on puberty blockers, hey, you're 12 years old. Don't get a tattoo because you're too young for that. But yes, let's go get you on some estrogen. Let's go get you on some testosterone. Like, that is weird to me. That is some strange logic to me. And
yes.
Yeah, so I would submit that there's a danger with it. The social media is the first draw, and Matt, he talks about this in the documentary too. He goes through, and I was like, are you paying attention to my oldest? Because I'm like, look at all, it's particularly on TikTok. There's a community of influencers that, yep, they become your pseudo family. And this is in my opinion, one of the number one ways that kids get involved in this stuff. Well, I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I don't feel like I fit in. Well, guess what? Every teenager feels that way. Everybody.
Right.
Yes. Like, we think that we're so unique, Alan, whatever we're going through. Everybody feels that way on some level, even as adults.
Right.
And so
we're just supposed to be able to manage it better.
Exactly. Yes. And so whenever these are, and I tell my daughter, I'm like, you're going to feel things you've never felt before. You're going to be angry and don't know why. Like, I want her to know her brain, Alan. I want her to know it's okay to cry, man. You're going to want to cry and not know why. And I'm okay with that. Just know that it's okay. Like, all these things. And, what happens is that there's a screen here that acts like your pseudo family. Oh, well, this is why I don't fit in. Wow, they are really understanding how I'm feeling. Wow, I want to know more about this. Yes, that's exactly how I feel. And so what happens is that you get drawn in, they get drawn in because of that thing that they have in common. They feel understood. Their parents all of a sudden look like enemies. And there's lots of stories about this where there have been kids that, because of the influencers, have been really affected and drawn into this. And kids are they think they know, all right? They think they know everything. But they're very impressionable, and we know it. So yeah, I'm with you on that. There's so much we'd probably do a whole video just on this topic. This is something I'm very passionate about. Yeah.
We really could. As a matter of fact, it's funny you mentioned that. Something else came to my mind too. When it comes to like how it affects children. I mentioned earlier about this concept of like movies and media and Disney and stuff like that. So like, don't get me wrong, y'all. I'm not one of these people that's like boycott Disney. Like, okay, I know I'm a very like balanced, evil, level-headed person. Like, I'm just saying be careful, because like even things like, I don't know, did you ever see the movie Turning Red? Are you familiar with like that,
yes,
that
I watched
movie?
That, yeah.
Okay. Right. So we watched it as a family, and at first I was like, oh, it's cool, okay, yeah. And then I started to realize like what was the underlying theme. And it's about this little girl who has this condition, and she turns into a bear, right? She turns into a bear, and basically at some point in the movie, they realize that there is a cure to turn her back into a girl, so she'll never become a bear ever again. But because she's becoming this bear, and she has this split personality, sometimes she's a girl. When she gets upset, she turns into a bear. And then now she feels more comfortable identifying as a bear. And at the end of the movie, the parents have the decision to make the decision, okay, we're going to give you this cure that we know will permanently turn you back into a girl, and you'll never have to deal with these bear feelings again. And what decision do the parents make? They make the decision to allow her to remain part girl and part bear, because at the end of the day, if that's who you identify as, then as a parent, it's my job to co-sign that, come alongside you and affirm you for how you feel. That is horror. That's crazy. Like, that is crazy these are some of the messages that are being permeated in these movies. So with that being said, I want to transition to one more thing, actually two more things. But the next thing I want to talk about is directly relates to you and I, because we are influencers, we're YouTubers. And it's this idea of like free speech and censorship, and kind of like the fact that as Christians, it's like we're not free to kind of talk and like express ourselves. Or if you're a business owner, you know, you have to like extend certain services. For instance, if you are a Christian and you are you have a wedding business, it's like you can't discriminate and say, okay, I'm not going to offer my services to people who are same sex and they want to get married. Like this whole idea of freedom and even censorship, the fear that I'm put out a video, even this video right now that I'm doing, like, I don't even know. I'm sitting up there thinking like, I got to make sure I don't say this and like bounce around my words and like carefully, because I don't know what YouTube's going to do, right? This might be, this conversation, it's healthy conversation between two adults, could be considered hate speech. And so what are your thoughts on like where this world is going when it comes to like censorship and kind of removing free speech and all that?
This is the core of the problem right here. This is what Roger would call soft totalitarianism, where if you can control free speech, you can control thoughts, right? And so that's one reason why censorship, I believe, has been such a big agenda on this, is that it is now considered hate speech to say what we're saying on many different levels. To disagree and not affirm is considered hateful. And I think that's really strange, because who defines what's hate speech then? Those who are in the power. And I'm finding more and more that we are the enemy. We are the fundamentalist Christians are the enemy of this. And it makes me wonder where we're going to be in 10 years. In fact, I made a funny satire. It's true, but it's supposed to be funny, and it's not at the same time, because it's true, where I'm talking to myself 10 years ago and I'm trying to convince myself like, yes, this is actually where we're at. This is happening, you know? And I'm like, no way. There's no way that we could be where we're at right now in society, where gender's on a spectrum. What does that even mean? You know? And so quickly it went downhill, and it makes me wonder where we will be in 10 years if this keeps going. And it makes me wonder, because the activists are very, very passionate. Aggressive is a better word. Yes. They're passionate. Aggressive is better. Very aggressive. Yes. And they believe that they have the high moral ground, because they believe that what they are doing is true and right, ironically true and right. And so what that means, though, is that if we're coming against them, we are the enemy. So I think that there is an element of not bowing the knee, because we are going to be pressured to do this. I think that a lot of Christians already have, if I'm honest. There's been influencers that have been swaying on this area, and they claim to be Christians. But I find it very odd that there's an element of control here with this. This isn't just like, oh, you know, let's listen to the lived experience of the LGBTQ plus community. That's their experience. And I need to listen to them, because they have the truth about what this actually is. And it's through those lenses I'm going to interpret what I think about it. That's typically the route they take, because they think it's the loving, more tolerant route. The problem is, again, it's not tethered to reality. It hurts them to not affirm them, which is equivalent to offense, right? So like that's what is identified as what's true, is that if it offends me, it's not true. It can't be true. I find that to be offensive, therefore I can't accept that as true. And I think as Christians that there has to be somebody that stands up and says this is not okay. And I think a lot more people are doing that. Some are bowing, but yeah, those are my general thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that is a perfect segue, guys, into the last thing that we're going to talk about today, as we kind of bring this to a close, is as Christians, like, how should we respond to all of this, right? Like, You have friends that are gay, you have friends that are trans, you have kids that might be struggling, you have kids that may want to get married and they want to invite you to their wedding, and to someone who's of same sex, or maybe you have a friend who's a Christian and they're same sex attracted, and but they're not acting on it, or somebody who is, or somebody who's attracted to you, or whatever it is. Like, as Christians, what should be our heart posture towards this? How can we balance the teachings of Christ and represent Christ in love and yet take a stand at the same time? So how can we as Christians kind of respond to everything that's going on?
Well, I first want to say, I don't think that I disagree with you equals I hate you, right? I think that we're kind of in a very hostile culture to Christian values, but also the fact that nobody wants to think critically anymore, because thinking has a tendency to make people disagree. And so I'm finding that more and more people are defaulting to this position because they don't want to think about it. And I don't think that's biblical. I don't think that's right. And there's an element of love. You mentioned this before, and I'm really glad that you did. Do not dehumanize them. Do not look at somebody that you disagree with even passionately disagree with hate. I don't think that that's the right approach. I do see a lot of hostility. I sometimes see that there are Christians that kind of come at them in an element. I mean, I think there's a right and wrong way to approach the situation, even if there's, your beliefs are correct, your approach may not be. And I think that we need to be very careful about that. I think there's a right and wrong way to approach. And I think that whenever we look at them, like they're made in the image of God and they're hurting. Like, I look at them as hurt people. And in fact, this is I'm doing a lot of research right now and into a lot of, different theologies, I guess I'll put it at this point. And a lot of people go into the New Age for this reason. They're really, really hurt. And so if I can be my own God and call my own shots, I won't be hurt again. So there's always something underneath it. And I find that whenever we can get to that, then it really helps set a foundation to talk about the love of Jesus, because and people think that, I can't remember who it was. There was an interview recently of a transgender woman. So it was a man identifying as a woman who was talking about some political commentator. And his comment was, I don't see Jesus in that. He was talking about his faith being very important to him. And I don't see Jesus in when people, say these kinds of things. And I thought that was really ironic, because you see, people can have different views of Jesus. It doesn't make it, the Jesus. We're warned about this. There's different gospels, different Jesuses, different views that people will have to define him the way they want him to be defined. And so to Christians, I would say, stand your ground on the level of truth. I mean, we can wake up every day knowing that 2 + 2 is 4, boys are boys, girls are girls. Like it's almost like we have to remind ourselves every day of that. But be grounded on what's true. And this is why Jesus says he's the bread of life. He says he's the living water. He's the one who sustains us spiritually. He is what they're looking for. So I would say those two things I would keep in mind when it comes to this spiritual battle. Yeah,
that's so well said. A couple things I'll add, guys, is that, the Bible says that Jesus came full of grace and truth, right? And I think that those two things are just so appropriate for us as Christians to always remember that we're always balancing the two, right? So how we deal with people, how we engage them, what we say about them, how we talk to them, how we treat them when they're around, when we're not around them. We have to make sure that everything that we do is based on grace, and our words are seasoned with grace, and we are, graceful towards them. But it also, we need to, as Melissa said, we need to make sure that as Christians, we need to stand up for these things. We need to, don't bow to what the world is trying to show you simply because it's the politically correct thing, right? You might have to take some heat. You might be unpopular in your community, in your neighborhood, because you might be the only person who feels a certain kind of way about, kids being able to use whatever bathroom they want to use in their school, or, one of the things that they brought up in the documentary is this whole issue of trans athletes.
Oh, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And yes. And, you know, you might be one of the unpopular people that's like, hey, it's not fair, you know, for a man who has more testosterone that's been given to him by God to be able to say, oh, you know what, I identify as a woman, and so therefore I'm going to compete in women's, you know, athletics. And, you know, that was one of the things that he pointed out, which is becoming, you know, a huge thing that is so devastating. You know, he interviewed one girl who was a track girl, and she said, people have no idea how long we as female athletes train just so we can shave off a couple of milliseconds from our track, just to shave off a couple of milliseconds just from running around the track. And then here's this trans man who identifies as a woman, and they're just like running laps around people. And it's like, the girl was so sad. She was like, you know what, man, it's tough to know that when I go into a race, I'm competing for second or third place straight out the gate. Yep. Right? So I bring all that up to say, like, guys, you know, you might be unpopular in your opinions about these things, but the last thing I'll say is this, is that the world will want to make us feel as though love equals acceptance. If you love me, you will accept who I am and what I'm doing. And if you don't accept who I am and what I'm doing, you don't love me. And when you start to logically think about that, guys, that definition of love is just absolutely insane. So for a friend, if I was cheating on my wife, would a friend say, you know what, because I love you, I accept what you do? If I wanted to go and do something inappropriate to a little girl, because I feel that, and because that's who I want to be, which no, I don't, I'm using this example, is my friend loving towards me if they say, hey man, you know what, I accept that because that's who you are and that's what you want to be and that's how you want to express yourself? No, love is not mean you accept that person and what they do. Love is, you know what, I'm going to love you, but we're going to have some hard conversations about how I disagree with what you're doing.
Yeah.
So
those
are my thoughts.
It makes you wonder though about the identity, because right now that's really what it's about, is your identity on the inside is who you authentically are. And that is the part of yourself that needs to be expressed to the outside world. And the outside world, as I said before, if they don't accept that, your true authentic self, then they are seen as the enemy. And that is such a good point, because it reminds me of the whole love is love. And I remember I interviewed my friend Jen, who was a former lesbian. It was a while ago, and we got in a conversation about this on and off camera. And one point she made was, I never really understood that, because where does it end? Like, if you have a pedophile, right? If you have somebody who, that's who they are on the inside. That's authentically who they are.
That's their identity.
And the thing is, though, is that, again, this is what happens when you untether morality and truth. Though both of those become subjective, this is what we see. This is what happens. But more than that, the other thing that she brought up was, what is it called when, like, a mother falls in love with her son? There's a word for it. But it's like interrelational type relationships, right? Where, well, love is love. Who are you to judge? I love my cousin. Love is love. That's who I am. And who are you to say who I can't love? And all these things, all of a sudden, all these consequences start coming out from this logic.
Yep.
And that's a really good point. And so I think we're going to probably see more of that in the next few years, unfortunately, as well, as things start getting more and more blurred.
So guys, obviously we could talk about this for way longer, but to bring this thing full circle, guys, if you have an opportunity, I really, 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 really highly recommend that you go check out the documentary, What is a Woman? Is on the Daily Wire. So you may have to get a subscription. You might be able to get a 30-day free trial. I'm sure they probably won't want me saying that, but you can check it out. But honestly, because I'm not saying you have to agree with everything that's on Daily Wire. I'm not saying I do. I'm not saying Melissa does. We're just saying
it's
that
good.
That's where the documentary is, because I know how y'all are. Check it out, guys, in all seriousness. and watch it with your kids if they are of age appropriate. I would say if they're like 13 or 14 or above, and you know, it might be some things you may have to, you know, watch it maybe by yourself first, and then you'll be able to know kind of maybe where some things you may want to fast forward or whatever. But it is so well done. You know, it really gets to the heart of the matter. So, Melissa, obviously I'm sure most of the people who watch my channel are subscribed to you and they're connected to you, but where can they find out more about you and get connected with you on all your socials and stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. That's where I do most of my things and stuff. I've made a few videos about this topic if you guys want to check it out. I also am available on Instagram, and I have a website. So and Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well. So if anybody wants to follow me, check out my stuff for more information, I'm sure. Hopefully I can, you know, shed some more light on this topic.
Yeah, and we'll put all the links to all of her socials and platforms in the description. So guys, thanks so much. We know this was a little bit of a long conversation, but hopefully you all enjoyed it, and hopefully it created some awareness, and hopefully some furthering some conversations that you might have, maybe somebody in your family, maybe somebody in your church, maybe some people that you are dealing with. And hey, if this video resonated with you and you maybe know someone who might be dealing with some of these things, feel free to share it with them. Hopefully it will make a difference in their life. So we will see you again another time. If there's another topic that you would like Melissa and I to do, let us know in the comment section. Maybe we'll do a collab on her channel next time and continue the conversation about this or other things. So thank you so much, Melissa, for being on, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.